Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence.
Okay, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and we are here for episode number 105 with very special guest, Dr. Megan Oxley. How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Doing pretty good. Like we were talking about right before we jumped on and started recording, you know, the weather in both of our areas has been a little strange. So right now in Colorado, it's, 5 degrees outside, and I'm kind of hunkered down with my 4 puppies and hanging out. So I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah. I'm really excited for us to actually be doing this today.
Yeah, me too.
Coming.
Yeah, so for the listeners, that don't get to see all the background stuff that happens, Megan and I have been trying to connect and do this podcast now for must be 6 months or so. And we just keep having to put it off for any number of reasons, mostly my fault. And I, definitely take accountability for that. But I'm so glad that we were able to come together, and like we've been texting back and forth, it will happen when it happens, and it will be it'll be a good thing
when it happens.
Yeah. So the first question that I want to ask is the same question I asked every one of my guests. And that is, that the podcast is called Conversations with the Mind. And when you hear that phrase, Conversations with the Mind, I just want to get a sense for, what does that mean to you? What comes up for you? Maybe any kind of visualization or memory, or just what comes up for you when you hear Conversations with the Mind? What does that mean to you?
So I think I'm viewing it in a very internal way. So like not with a mind out over there, but like within my own mind, and thinking about how a lot of the work that I deal with is how most of our mind is not really front and center. It doesn't really have a voice most of the time, right? At the table, there's this one voice that's really loud and in charge and doing all this stuff, but there's like all these other voices that are part of the conversation. And I am always working with helping people bring all of their voices to the table and try and actually make it be a conversation and not just like a one-man show. So that's what I think like conversations means with the mind. It's within the own mind, and like bringing them all together, because that's what we are at the end of the day, is all those pieces, even though there's kind of only one that we see or engage with on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to jump into that. That's such an interesting topic for me, like parts theory and, theory of mind in general, both our own, what we perceive as our own individual mind, but also the idea of a collective mind and us being a part of that as well. So I definitely want to get into that. But before we do, I was wondering if you can just give the audience just a brief overview of who you are and what you do. Sure. And maybe to provide a little bit of context for the listeners as to, where you're coming from when we are discussing these topics.
Yeah. So I am an emergency medicine physician by training. I graduated in 2009. And I spent a good deal of time in the emergency department before I kind of found my current true love, which is I'm the owner and founder, medical director for Michigan Progressive Health. We are an integrative ketamine clinic with 2 locations in Michigan. I've been doing ketamine infusions for mental health and chronic pain for 6 years now. And the clinic and our scope of work has grown over the last 6 years. And that's really where I focus my time as intention, is using ketamine and future psychedelics to help people achieve wellness, both mentally and physically. So
that's a huge, or it seems like for me, being from the mental health field and you from the medical field, I don't have much insider knowledge of the medical field myself, but that seems like quite a departure from your initial training, emergency medicine, really trying to, with a focus, and again, this is from my ignorant mind, with a focus more on the body, and healing the body. Western medicine doesn't really delve too much into the mind and mind body type medicine in mainstream medicine anyway. So then you have this huge shift into working, with ketamine, and you mentioned chronic pain. So there are some benefits to the body, but primarily when we're working with psychedelics, these are for mental issues, things like that. So what made you want to transition your primary focus from emergency medicine, sort of Western-based medicine, into this whole other realm of psychedelic medicine, which traditionally has not been Western, but it has been, more indigenous, and then it has found its way into our Western medicine?
Oh, there's so much even in that question. Like, let's totally put a pin in the idea of chronic pain and come
Okay.
back. Okay. Yeah, ketamine, and I didn't really necessarily 100% understand at the time. And I'm really willing to be honest about my journey coming from totally Western medicine to this place where I think it's East meets West, where we're using a medicine, but working with the mind and like really weaving those concepts together in a beautiful way. And I can't say that that's what I knew would happen when I started on this journey, but I'm certainly very happy where I am. What I've kind of, the way I tell the story is that when you're in medicine, there were all of these kind of questions and patterns that were below the surface of my training and education that didn't have like words to them, but there were all these things that didn't kind of make sense. First and foremost, I was always really struck by like why humans in general were just kind of physically sicker than any other animal on earth. Like, why did we have so many diseases when like giraffes and zebras and even dogs have more, but they don't have, like, wild animals don't have nearly as many diseases as we do. And I just like had a question about that in my mind. And then, you're in medical school and you learn that, let's say like Black people have more high blood pressure than white people. And we're taught that it's genetic, but that didn't really make a lot of sense to me because we are from the same, gene pool ultimately at the very, very, beginning of the day. That didn't make too much sense to me. And there's kind of these little examples of, there's more examples of that. And I won't, get into it, of just where I'm like, this Western medicine doesn't quite have the right answer for this. Like, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Especially once I got into the emergency room, there were patterns of illness, patterns of behavior, both being in the emergency room, like a response to an illness or, a response to a trauma that just kept coming up over and over. And that would also include physical patterns as well, like allergies to medications, the amount of autoimmune conditions a person would have. And they clump together in these patterns. And everyone in emergency medicine kind of like, you would make jokes about them. We all recognize the pattern, but we didn't understand what that was. And I was listening to Gabor Mate quite a while ago. And when all of those pieces really came together, what I was seeing, what was dictating these patterns, what was creating these clusters was trauma. Trauma from, young childhood all the way up until, previous to when you experienced. And it's not like physical trauma, right? It's not like I broke my elbow and so my elbow always acts the same way. It's, I had alcoholic parents and now I have X, Y, and Z. And you just kind of see that over and over and over again. And you're seeing that over and over. Anyways, that's really what made me go, I'm really missing something here in the emergency room. Right? Like, I can fix your broken ankle and I can tell you you're not having a heart attack, and I'm keeping people well in that sense. And I'm relieving anxiety. And it was very rewarding, emergency medicine. I loved it. I have nothing really bad to say about it, but I found that there was an even better way to really heal people. And that was through addressing how, ultimately the mind was influencing all of these physical things. Right? How your mind is, I've literally seen people's minds create hives, right? Like hives are supposed to be an allergic reaction. You get a bee sting and you get a hive, well, people's own psychiatric condition or psychologic state could create hives in their body. And I was like, I want to look at that. I want to understand what that is. I want to help people with that. I want to manipulate that in a good way. So that's why the jump from emergency medicine to ketamine and then all the other things that it'll entail is because it gives you this opening between those two, the connection between those two things and the opening for a new avenue of healing.
Nice. So by being in the field of Western medicine, it very quickly pointed out some of the limitations of Western medicine, right? And, I've seen that too. And that's what I was talking about, Western medicine being primarily focused on healing the body. I even see it in my field of psychology and mental health therapy, that some of these sources are unseen. Some of them are under the surface. Some are subconscious, and even there's theories out there. And I've seen some of these, some of the results of possibly this theory being correct, but spiritual sources of illness too, which Western medicine completely, does not even touch on the spiritual. And same with Western mental health too, which is kind of where my practice is kind of unique because most of my clients come in talking about spiritual issues, and I love diving into those, But yeah, for a long time, we thought that all bodily related issues are caused by the body. And now you're seeing definitely, the power of the mind, not just to create illness in the body, but also for healing too.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite books of all time, I don't know if you've ever read it, it's called The Intention Experiment by Lynn McTaggart, and she talks in a number of her chapters about the mind's ability to influence us on the physical level too. She goes into research on things like spontaneous remission, where these patients are going to see their cancer doctors. The cancer doctor says you only have a couple months to live, and then the person, because of their attitude, because of their mindset, well, we don't know for sure, but the doctors had no idea how this person healed, and then their cancer just completely disappeared. There are a number of studies showing that someone's attitude during medical procedures can definitely influence the results they get. So people who go in with positive attitudes tend to heal faster. People who have negative, pessimistic type attitudes about their health tend to do worse. And that attitude component is really quite interesting and under the patient's control, right? And this sort of leads to one of the major theories in psychedelic medicine that I think should be integrated back into Western medicine, and that is the concept of the inner healer, right? So we talk a lot about that in psychedelic medicine and even mental health too, where someone almost needs to recondition their thoughts about how healing occurs. We're almost conditioned into this thinking that if we are sick or have a broken bone or something's wrong with us, then we need to get our solutions from some external source in order to heal us. And I thought that too for a really long time. And so someone broke it down to me and said, even if you get a cut, like a huge laceration, like the doctor doesn't heal that cut. They set the stage, they set the setting so that the healing can occur. And then the body literally heals itself from the bottom of that cut up to the surface. And once I started, applying that theory to a number of different physical maladies, it started to make a lot more sense that if these things are starting from an internal source, why can we not influence them on that level too? I'm not saying that Western medicine and doctors are not needed. They're very needed. But this really opens the door for patients and clients to become empowered and really realize that they and their mind have so much more influence over their health and injury and things like that than we had previously been taught. And I love that piece.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some of my earlier, some of the other things that really stood out for me was like understanding the power of placebo and really like diving into placebo type studies, right? Like, so if you have like a torn, torn cartilage in your knee, and the orthopedic surgeon goes in, he sticks a couple little, they're called trocars. He sticks a couple of these like pen-like things in there and cleans it up and makes it all smooth for you and all that kind of stuff. And you can do that, or you can just stick the pens in and not touch anything. And the remission rates and recovery rates are exactly the same. So even if you're not like actually fixing the meniscus, but just by doing the procedure alone, the patient thinks that they're better. And I just was like so flabbergasted by those results. I was like, wait a minute, like placebo, I think is a word Western medicine uses to understand how the mind influences the body, right? I mean, that's pretty much what it is. And so, I, in a good way, but the word exploit doesn't really allow for that. But, I would use that to my advantage as often as possible in the emergency room to just help people, not give people medicines and not give them a fake medicine and tell them it was something else, but just using the power of their mind in that way. Like, you're going to get better from this, this is going to be really easy for you. This is whatever, and like setting, like you said, kind of setting that stage. It made me think about too, like, really until the 1920s, 1930s, physicians didn't make patients any better. For a long time, physicians have been around and not actually improved outcomes. But the original meaning of the word was to be a teacher. And so what I think now my job is to teach people how to listen to their inner healer and give them all these ways to do it and give them proof that they can do it, right? Like, people love science, unfortunately. And so like, hey, science shows that you can do this, and science shows this. And like, did you know this? And it's like, I'm not the one doing the healing. I'm just teaching the patient how to access their own healing. That's a lot of how I see what we do.
Exactly. Sure. I like to say that if I'm being a good therapist, I'm trying to work myself out of a job. And I tell my clients that all the time, who a lot of clients come to me thinking that I'm going to heal them, that I'm a therapist and I'm going to heal whatever's going on with them. And I set that expectation from the beginning. I say, look, I'm not healing anything. I'm helping you heal yourself. I'm teaching you that you have the power to heal yourself, and hopefully one day you will need me. Right. So we're talking about placebo, and for the listeners out there that don't know necessarily what that means, placebo, it's the belief that something is going to be effective, and therefore that belief influences the outcome. There's also an opposing word, the nocebo effect, which is new to me within the last 5 or so years, where if you believe that a treatment is not going to work for you, then it influences the outcome that way, in a negative way. Even if all the science and everything tells you that this medication or this procedure is going to work for you, if you have a strong enough belief that it won't, then I think that does have a significant impact on whether your body even opens itself up to accept the medication into the system, or whether it accepts a surgical procedure or rejects it, and so really interesting stuff. So in your practice, we're talking about this theoretically, and I know exactly what you're talking about. We're both practitioners in the field, but for our listeners out there who don't know this information, it's coming to them for the first time. Can you give some practical examples of application of how you might, with a patient who, let's say a patient comes in and they've tried so many things, so they've been treatment resistant to whatever their malady is. How would you engage either the placebo effect or the nocebo effect in a situation with a client? And for the listeners out there, try and give them something practical that they may be able to apply today to start to realize that power of their mind.
I think the first placebo thing that we do is actually take away the label of treatment resistance. So right now, nasal esketamine is approved for treatment resistant depression. So everybody comes in feeling like, I am treatment resistant. I'm I'm all whatever because I'm not responding to medicines. And so one of the first things that we do, like as if it's a choice or something, or you're a bad person. That's like really is a very heavy stigma that comes to that is carried by the patients that we see.
People come in and say, I'm so bad at everything in my life, I'm even bad at healing.
100%, right? And so the first thing we do is remove that label by saying, you're not treatment resistant. No one gave you the right treatment. So it's not you, it's us. You know, it's Western medicine, it's psychiatry. We have not taught you the right tools. We haven't given you the right opportunities. We haven't pushed you in the right direction. It's on us. And so that's the first thing we do is just relieve that, almost like that beginning of the nocebo effect. Like, this isn't going to work for me because nothing else worked for me. We're taking that away, because it's not that nothing else worked for you. That wasn't meant for you. That wasn't right. And we set that stage. And then that's a message that we reinforce like really frequently. It is interesting. I just have to throw this in as an aside. So one of the first things that my office manager noticed, he's very passionate about mental health. That's how we kind of got together in this way. One of the very first things he would notice, because he was fielding the phone calls and scheduling the consults and stuff, the patients who like scheduled themselves and were like, oh my God, I read about this and I'm going to get better. And like, can you get me on the schedule right away? Always did better than the patients who were drug in by their family member. The family was like, oh, they're so bad, they need help, they whatever. And you'd bring them in and their response rate was always less than the person who was like, oh, I know that's going to work for me.
Yeah, I see that in the addiction field too. And we talk about that you can't heal yourself from it. No one else can heal you from your addiction. Yeah. It's up to you. Yeah, I definitely see that.
Yeah. So one of our other kind of placebo, if you will, activities, and one that is, like I said, scientifically proven, love my science, even though there's a lot that science can't explain, but it is scientifically proven, is to help people start doing positive affirmations. So what you say about yourself, right? We said what you think about the treatment and what you think about yourself will become the truth, right? So we talk a lot about adopting a power pose a couple times a day, saying that, you know, you're safe, you're strong, there's nothing wrong with you, or like whatever there's multiple mantras that will help build with a patient for them to say a couple of times a day, and build the placebo within themselves of, I can do this, like I can heal, I'm strong enough to do this, or whatever. And a lot of times the phrases seem really hokey to people at first, you know, like, again, people don't feel strong. They feel super weak because they've never gotten better. But it's also like, whoa, look at how strong you are. You went through this and this and this, and every day you're suicidal and you're still here. You're amazing, you know, and I mean it when I say that, but that again is building that, like, oh, I am the placebo, right? So those are like just kind of a brief, like peek into how we use that in our work on a regular.
Awesome. Yeah, I do that a lot too. My methods are, my practice is a lot of mindfulness-based stuff. So all my clients, whenever they come in, we always sit down and do a 10-minute meditation together to center ourselves into the session and let go of outside stuff. But also, one of my goals is so that my clients leave my sessions each time with a brand new tool that they can practice for the week that follows. And it's very difficult. You know, a lot of clients come in with that negative self-concept, negative self-talk nonstop. And then when we introduce the idea of, oh, hey, like just say something positive about yourself, or listen to this positive affirmations meditation, I always ask them, what was that like for you afterwards? They're like, well, it sounded good, but I didn't believe a word that they said. And that's perfectly normal. That's perfectly normal for the process, right? You got to start somewhere. But the more you do it with repetition, you know, you're rewiring, you're literally training your brain to think, or your mind to think differently about yourself. Some of the other techniques I use, definitely positive affirmation meditations, especially when people have a tough time developing their own statements about themselves from their mind. Sometimes you're like, I cannot generate a positive statement about myself. I just can't do it. So we introduce, guided meditations. I love this technique. So I tell people that you should get a dry erase marker and on your mirror in your bathroom, when you come across a positive statement that really catches you, write it down on your mirror. And subliminally, each day when you go to
Yeah.
in front of the mirror, whether you say it out loud or not, if your brain registers that phrase is there, then that too is going to play in and start to rewire that stuff. So eventually, within a few weeks or a few months of just practicing, most patients notice that their mindset starts to change out of this negative to a more positive. And then we definitely start to see major improvements in their treatment after that switch sort of happens.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to go back to what we were originally talking to before we get too into the weeds, because this is really, when we're talking about mind and parts theory, I think that too is setting sort of a context for some of the later discussions we're going to have. So I'm going to start with just a general discussion I brought up on the podcast before, and that is location of mind. And you talked about this in the very beginning as well, like my own internal mind. And certainly here in the West, fortunate, I think this is a flaw in Western thinking, but we tend to think that our mind and brain are the same. We equate those two words together, and we believe that our mind is sort of located in the neural structure of the brain somewhere. Our consciousness is up here, and there's hundreds of other theories of mind that say the opposite, that our mind is not just in our brain. The brain is maybe an antenna to filter consciousness out from this larger substrate of consciousness that is always surrounding us, and that mind is actually not located in our body or in our brain, but is out there in the world. And that the body, as a vehicle, as a vessel, has sensory organs that interact with this larger mind and then filter them into our body, and somehow through our cognitive processes we develop an ego and start to individuate ourselves, right? So then we can get stuck in that ego and thinking that we are separate from everything else, when in reality, we could be connected to everything through this consciousness field. So just real quick before we jump into subset of internal mind and parts theory, what is your idea of location of mind and its relationship to larger streams of consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that there's mind here in your head. So I'm pointing to my head, but there's also mind in your body. So, and especially, kind of along your chakra system, but like really in the chest and the heart, there's a lot there, right? So the mind exists in all of these pieces. And I do think it is connected to a greater sense of, I guess you could call it mind, or I usually just feel like it's connected to the universe in its entirety. And so our bodies and the physical brain, it is like a filter through which that's coming, and then everything kind of gets expressed. And I think it was like an imperfect system. I think there's a couple of things that our physical brains do that don't serve our mind the way that we would want them to. So I think we actually still have some evolving to do in terms of like the structures and how the physical brain reacts to certain things. I think that there still is some finessing if there's ever.
What are some examples of that you're talking about? How the brain doesn't match up?
So it has to do with ego strength, and it also has to do a little bit with like trauma response and the amygdala, like the sensitivity of the amygdala. And we're in this place where I don't think the amygdala can really properly, and I think it's also a bit of like where our society is. The amygdala can't really like register can't differentiate the severity of threats in this world. A lot of things in this world are a threat, and maybe it isn't the amygdala fault, maybe it is really just our society, but there is some ability to like not really be able to differentiate like how severe threats are. And then how then the physical brain makes all of those threat signals very sticky, and a little too sticky, I think, because it's too complex for our world, is too complex for how intensely the amygdala holds on to signals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, the amygdala being responsible for like fight or flight, right, freeze or faint type responses. And from what it sounds like, you're saying that because society is the way it is today, that our systems are kind of out of whack, and people are not able to distinguish between low threat and high threat, that everything is now a threat.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that would, in my mind, that would create, greater reactivity in people for situations that don't need that level of response. And that's really quite interesting, because our society, the way, at least here in the US, like, we, for the most part, have all of our basic needs taken care of. You can go to the
Yeah.
grocery store and get food. You don't have to worry about large cats and animal predators.
Right.
We don't have a lot of the survival threats that we did when we were evolving in the past. And those sort of threat responses have carried forward into this, I call it, we're in a marshmallowy type of world these days. Everything's nerfed and cushioned. And it's almost like people are seeking out threats. They're seeking out ways to feel these responses, but they don't know how to deal with it. That's really interesting. I think for me personally, I attribute a lot of my own threat response to my martial arts training. So I had, a kind of a rough childhood where I experienced quite a bit of trauma, and sort of my fight or flight response was raw at times, and I would overreact to smaller threats, but it was out of a protective mechanism, because I didn't want things to happen or hurt me like they did in the past. And then with martial arts training, and literally like mindful, intentional training around responses, I can now go into a seriously threatening situation and not feel as threatened, because I know my own capability to handle a threat, right? Like, you, with it being an emergency practitioner too, I'm sure, like, if you saw a car wreck and a car on fire and people crawling on the ground needing help, you wouldn't necessarily run away from that in fear, but you have trained yourself to run towards threat on some level to help people. And I'm the same way. I'll run into a fire to help someone, as opposed to running away from it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. A funny story. I had to drive on the highway to work all the time. And like one night in the rain, in the dark, on a curve, somebody was in a car crash, and like ever the ER doctor, I was like, I better stop to see if I can help. And like, it wasn't after the fact. It was like, that was the stupidest thing that I could have done, was like pull over in an unsecured site to like try and help this person. And anyways, I think that there used to be Tiger. So Tiger was like crazy stress, but then like when there wasn't a tiger, your nervous system could operate at a very low, and your amygdala, it was very, very low. You could really reset down to like almost zero, like nothing's happening, spending days just, I'm granted, like hunter-gatherer society. It's not like every day it was just like sunshine and roses, like watching the clouds, but you could really kind of reset your nervous system in a way that I don't think that we can anymore, because I'm like listening right now, right? There's like a train and there's a sound maker, and my kid, it's just like constant notification, constant things that you have to pay attention to. Your brain is always like, is that important? Is it not important? And there's just always this. And then we've made social media. And so, do they like me? Did someone respond? Do I have any emails? We've just created this place where we're always trying to be alert. And then that system really gets burnt out and really goes haywire because of it. So, yeah. And I also think that the ego, and I can't necessarily say exactly physically how the ego specifically works. I am not a neuroscientist. I mean, I'm trying to learn all these things. But like, yeah, the ego strength, the way that happens, and I believe there is a very physical nature to that, has maybe again evolved. Maybe it's an America thing, but there's something that doesn't serve us, I think, there as well.
Yeah, I agree. And when we talk about this, response to threat, oh, can you hear my co-host in the background, my little puppies? Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's a little unfortunate too that people are reacting in overblown or even aggressive or violent ways to people because they have disagreements with them, rather
Yeah.
than bringing their nervous system down to a place where you can have a talk or a debate with someone, and be constructive. So I definitely see that too. And bringing back in parts work and parts theory. So for the listeners out there, parts theory is not new. It's been around for a while, but in psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, we do engage IFS quite a bit, which is internal family systems. It's not the only one that we engage, but it's become one of the most popular. So parts theory, at its most basic, says that our ego or our mind is not just one voice inside of us, that we actually have lots of different parts. We have lots of different voices in our head that respond to different situations. A different version of Shane may come out with my best friend, as opposed to the version of Shane that comes out with a potential employer who's interviewing me, my professional self, my therapeutic self, my athletic self, who I am to my wife. All these are not the same person, as some theories would say, but they're each different versions of myself that appear in order to manage the situation. And sometimes these parts can override the system and become, maybe my angry self is very active, and it overrides the rest of the selves, and I become angry or irritable in situations when it's not useful, or situations where that version of myself is not really the most effective one to come forward. So, and like I said, there's lots of different ways that parts and names for these different parts from various theories. So my own idea of how I conceptualize that is kind of a mishmash of a lot of these different ones. But before, you were talking about, the executive self and then other selves too, where the executive self is sort of like the chairman of the board. They're not necessarily in charge all the time, and a good leader, will listen to and allow their other voices to come forward and use their strengths in situations.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about how you think about parts work and how you use it in your own practice and in your daily life too?
So I am not a parts work practitioner. What I know has just been from osmosis of working in this field.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, I feel a little bit unprepared or not unprepared, but just like really not the expert in this field. IFS training is something I really, really want to do, and I understand the pieces of it. For in a more practical way, and like not getting into the technicality and the language of the parts work, I guess when I think about the voices and the different parts that we have and letting one speak versus the other is like around your subconscious and thoughts that we have, but then other voices kind of suppress, right? So there's one part of us that like knows that we're like intrinsically completely good, or that we weren't responsible for something, or this is how we want to show up here. But then there's other parts that have anxiety, or like you can't do that, or like, but what about this? And so I don't have the technical beautiful language of IFS to kind of explain how those are all dancing in our brains, only to say that like it's great. We can often use ketamine to calm down the really anxious parts, the ones that are being the loudest, the ones that are protecting, and that to let the other parts come forward. But I don't feel like I'm really answering your question very well.
No, that's fine. And it is just a conversation. So neither one of us are experts on this. We're both kind of exploring this together right now in the moment.
Yeah.
For those of you out there who are listening to this and you're like, what the hell are they even talking about? I just want to give like maybe two real quick examples of how I have applied parts work to be more effective in life. Okay. So, one example, if I'm sitting down to write a paper for my PhD program, and usually when I sit down at the computer, either my procrastinator self comes out, or the self comes out that just says, it's the imposter syndrome self. What am I even doing? Should I even, should I quit before I even start this paper? And that's very unproductive for me. I'll sit there in front of my computer for 30 minutes or an hour and write one sentence and just be like, this is a waste of time. Okay. So now when I sit in front of the computer, with intention, and I know that this self is habitually coming up and kind of preventing me from getting work done, I'll sit at my computer and I'll just close my eyes for 30 seconds or a minute. And I'll sort of just take a few deep breaths and ask, sort of an internal conversation with myself. Okay, procrastinator self, you're not really needed at this time. So I'm going to choose to engage the self inside of me that is really excited about this work, that is really interested in sharing a message that's connected to like my higher purpose. And then, as I'm doing this, like just internally with this mental exercise, I will literally start to feel energetic charge throughout my body. I will start to feel myself scooting to the edge of my seat now because I'm really excited to dig in. And then I'll open my eyes and boom, I'm off to the races, and I may have to do that process a few times in my, few hours of writing. That's been really helpful. Another example is like if I was planning on going to jiu-jitsu training at night and I'm just like, oh, I really don't want to go. No one will know if I just don't go. Like that self comes out, the lazy self that's telling me I'd rather sit on the couch and watch TV. And then again, I have to close my eyes 30 seconds or a minute and just really bring out the part of me that is so connected to my martial arts practice, that loves it with more than anything, and bring that out. And when I sit with that feeling just for a little bit and I open my eyes, then I'm really motivated to go in. And I always seem to have better training sessions too when I tap into and engage a particular version of myself that is it's more in alignment with what the task is in front of me.
I think we have found it helpful to also explore where those parts kind of like came from and how they did probably at some point in time serve you like as a human being, right? So this kind of goes back to like all of this negative self-talk that we tend to, like many of us tend to have, right? Like constantly critical. And so it's no different when you sit down and your procrastinator self shows up and then the other part goes like, oh, look at that. There's that procrastinator, like, and then all that creates a whole nother loop of like, man, I wish I didn't have that procrastinating part. Why is that guy around? Like, I hate him, and just kind of recognizing they usually, again, they served a purpose. They came from a place, and like doing the work to understand that, and then being able to find compassion for that part. Like, oh, this is my procrastinator part that showed up because if I didn't do something that was perfect, my dad beat me, and so like recognizing the procrastinator helped you at some point in time helps you find, again, like a little more love for that part. And then that part can then like step away. Cause like you're intentionally tapping into the part that you want, but you can also ask that part to step away. Like, hey, procrastinator, thanks for showing up today. I don't really need you. Why don't you go ahead and have a seat? Cause I'm really cool with what I'm about to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think early on in my own self-development, looking into these things, I had this idea, and I think a lot of people have this idea that once you become aware of these things, and one of our initial thoughts is, well, I identified all these negative parts of myself. I'm just going to destroy them. They're not useful for me at all anymore. I'm just going to eliminate them and only focus on the ones that are effective for me. And, I have a bit of a Buddhist background, and I lean that way a little bit. And when I looked into this, as far as what some of the Buddhist perspectives were, they said, you literally cannot destroy parts of yourself. Like if you destroy the negative parts of yourself, you will cease to exist. Like you will not, it's impossible. You can't do it. And so that what they say is really what those parts are, like the procrastinator self or the self that gets angry, they're just like they're part of you, and they're seeking attention, and when they don't get that attention, they tend to force their way out to get that attention. And so when you notice things like the procrastinator self, you can give it that attention, say, hey, hi, how are you? I see you. And hopefully get to a place where you're like, I love you. You served me so well. You are an amazing piece of me, and I acknowledge that you're there, but you're just not needed right now. So it's a totally different way of looking at yourself as parts, that you can't destroy. And if you're on a mission to destroy parts of yourself that are ineffective, you're going to end up hurting yourself in a lot of ways, right? Rather than coming to a place of acceptance. Hey, these things exist. They're still useful maybe in certain scenarios, but I need to gain some greater sense of mental control over these parts and become the big boss again and not let these parts rule me. You know what I mean? Yeah. I love that. I love talking about part stuff. It's so interesting. Jim Fadiman, I've had him on the podcast a couple times. He just wrote a book called Synchronicities of Self. And it talks a lot about all the different parts theories over centuries and all the different, and how they're sort of coalescing now in our modern mental health industry. Okay, so I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk to you about motherhood. Right? I'm not a parent, and you are, and I'm always fascinated. I want to have kids someday. Don't know if that's going to happen, but I'm fascinated about not only parenting, but what I call psychedelic informed parenting. Okay? So what that means to me is that, if you have psychedelic experiences, you come to think about the universe and existence in much different ways than everyday life, And when you come out of those, hopefully, you bring back that information and integrate it. It has major influences on how you show up in life, including parenthood. And so after you've had these intense experiences of whether it be oneness with the universe or you have ancestral visions of who you were in past lives or who this child is of yours and what relation they are to you in a cosmic sense, not just in this life, and you come out of these experiences, how does being psychedelically informed and having these different types of experiences, how does that change the way you parent with your kids?
Yeah. So I was raised Episcopalian. And I really I wasn't fervent, but I was quite Christian until, college. And then in college, I was like, wait, I'm Episcopalian because my parents raised me that way. And if I had been born in India, I'd be something else. And if I was born in this place, I'd be something else. And why is Episcopalian? Why would that be the only thing that there is, And so I really kind of just left religion altogether. And I really didn't even identify as spiritual. I'm just like, this is all just a construct to help people be good people. Is how I've always seen religion, right? This is just the way that we all teach each other to be good people. And so in a way, without religion, when my children were younger, I do think it was actually a little bit harder to teach ideas of what it meant to be a good person and how you behaved, because we weren't doing it in a religious context and we weren't doing it in a spiritual context. And we were just we were modeling good behavior, but there wasn't a big picture for it. And now that I've had experiences with non-ordinary states of consciousness and had that connectedness and do also lean quite Buddhist, I have a new framework to be helping my kids be good kids, talking about how we're all connected, explaining that we're all living things and we're all one, and why, putting out what you want to come back to you. It's really created this frame and really created a framework that makes it easier to share the ideas that I had been stewing on for a long time with my kids, but in a way I think that has more meaning. And I kind of can't wait for them to get old enough and I can be around when they have their first psychedelic experience. And then we can kind of come back and talk about how all the things we've been talking about, over the years may or may not, you don't know, have showed up for them during those experiences, because you never know. So I also think that psychedelic experiences have made me a better mother by showing what is important versus what isn't important. All of these ideas that one that I'm actually that hits a lot for me right now is that I was raised in a very performance focused household in terms of grades and showing up and overachieving. And my kids they don't, they get sick kind of often, and they want to stay home when they have like the littlest stomach ache. My kids want to stay home. They're 8 and 11 too, for the record. So like they're in 3rd and 6th grade. And there is this part of me that every time when they want to stay home, they have a belly ache, maybe there's nothing else going on, they don't really seem that sick. There's this one part of my brain that was trained in childhood that's like, go to school, get good grades, you have to learn. And then the part of my brain that's developed since having these these experiences is like, listen, they're a kid. They need to rest. They don't need to go to school 5 days a week. Love them, keep them at home, and they can go back when they feel well, And I just don't think, my husband and I actually constantly talk about the fact that it's probably not normal for kids to go to school 5 days a week, most of the year when you're 8 years old, and that probably isn't exactly what they need. And so if they need to be at home with their parents and reset their nervous system, take a time out, like even a teacher just said, like, it's loud, the lights are bright, it's constantly scheduled, like that may not be what a kid needs. And so I hope that made sense as an example of how those experiences have really influenced how I parent. And I'm willing to bet that our kids stay home way more than most other. And I think it is easier too, because my husband stays at home. So it's like, we don't have to do the struggle of who's going to watch the kids. I recognize that influences it, but it feels good to just be like, they're a kid. They need love. They don't need school, they need love and open acceptance and structure, like consistent boundaries. And that's it.
I think those things that you're teaching them, staying home, resting, being in tune with your body, those kind of things are much greater lessons than what they're going to learn in a day of school anyway.
Oh, yeah.
I love it when, this sidebar, but I love when parents take their kids out of school for like a week or two and then go on like an international trip. I'm like, that is so much better education than what they're getting in the classroom. And honestly, I believe that forcing kids to go to school for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, the only thing that's training them to do is to work in the workforce under, conditions that we've found are not even good for us, right? We're training people to work for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And that's not a good model. So your kids are definitely at, you said 6 and 11?
8 and 11.
8 and 11. So they're definitely at ages where they've been exposed to, really big existential concepts like death, things like that, and may not have the framework or whatever to fully process what that means and what that means to them and their own mortality and those that they love. I'm wondering, because after I've had some non-ordinary states of consciousness, my ideas around things like death have shifted so drastically to the point where I'm not afraid of death. I think most people are afraid of how they're going to die, and those kind of fears are largely not even present for me anymore, because I feel like, number one, it's the most natural thing that is ever going to happen to us. We can't fail at it, so the fear of failing at death somehow is gone. And then I get a sense that, death is just a doorway to something greater, to something next. It's not the end of anything. So how do your psychedelic experiences or non-ordinary states, including like breath work and meditation, how do those influence how you talk to your kids about concepts such as death?
My daughter, who was 11, she was 6 when our dog of 15 years passed away. And what I loved, it was hard. It was very hard. But what I loved about that experience is that for several months, my daughter felt like the dog was coming in and checking on her at night. And we just kept saying that was true. Absolutely, Callie is coming to check on you. Like she loves you. She wants to be there for you. For sure, you are feeling her spirit, feeling her energy, whatever you want to call it. Like, absolutely, that's true. And I think that just continued and has continued in our conversations of like, that's what happens. You just become part of the universe. And so you're never really gone, you're just in this other place. And like, we talk around ideas of reincarnation, like, oh, I'd like to come back as a tree and like, be an elephant, or like, who knows what it's going to be. So we talk about all of that. And we'll see what happens too, because my mother is on hospice, and so we've been having conversations about, she'll be dying soon, and what does that mean, and what will it look like, and certainly won't take away all the sadness, but I'm continue to look forward to having those opportunities to inform those decisions for them, and to not like us, like you said, I'm not afraid of my mother dying. Like, I will be sad. I'm going to be very sad, but I'm not afraid. And I'm not like railing against it. We're just like letting it be this very, I wish we kind of lived together, because it could be even more of a, just like you said, it's a very natural thing. This is what happens. And so, I'm sure we'll have more opportunity to have those conversations, but I think it's been helpful to not just be like, oh, they went to doggy heaven and they're fine now, they're chasing squirrels. Like, it just doesn't give any like real concept of what it could be. And I don't think it really helps them. Yeah. I also don't, I still have this, I don't particularly fear death, but I do worry a lot about like my children being motherless, like that's the thing that kind of, there's where my fear is now, that I'm still like working on, because I just think that would stink.
Yeah. I'm not sure, you and I have not really discussed our individual altered state experiences, but I'm wondering if you've ever had an ego death type experience. For me, there's a common question or common line of thought that comes up for me, like as I'm right on the edge of an ego death. And this line of questioning for a long time kept me on this side of the veil. It would not allow me to pass through and fully release into like a mystical type experience. So the line of questioning that would come is very similar to what you were saying about your kids being motherless. I'd have these thoughts like, of course, like, oh man, I'm dying. Oh, this is not as bad as I thought, number one, but what does that mean for what I'm leaving behind? And I have thoughts of like, is my wife going to be okay? My dog's going to be okay? What is my brother going to think when I die? And then I get these resounding answers from some kind of higher inner source that just keeps saying, it'll be okay. They're going to be okay. Like, even if you die right now, your wife's going to be fine. She's going to grieve, but she's going to be okay. Your dogs are going to be fine. Your brother's going to be okay. Everyone is going to be okay without you there. Their life will go on. And an acceptance of that okayness is the one thing that I've noticed has allowed me to fully let go and release into the other side of that veil and have these out of body type experiences where I had an ego death. So I too, I hear you on that. I think that's actually a pretty common line of questioning, and when people are unable to feel okay with their ego death, it prevents them from going to that level. Have you experienced that as well?
Well, I have two thoughts about it. The first one is around the questioning of what am I afraid of? Because like when people are trying to access non-ordinary states of consciousness, fear gets in the way. And that may just be having a psychedelic experience, that might be getting the next level, and that might be a full-blown ego death. It's fear that's like holding people to whatever state that they're in. And so it's, that was at that moment, that's what you were afraid of, like what's going to happen to those people. And I can remember having a similar moment where I was like, okay, I need to let go, but I'm not letting go. Like, what am I afraid of? And like point blank, like asking myself the question of like, what am I afraid of? Just to get to the next level. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to pull out. In the last several years, I continue to learn around how big preparation for experiences like that can be, and then how big the integration process is. And it's really funny that you're bringing me back to an experience from a long time ago in which I was a pillar of light and my kids were pillars of light. And the message was like, the universe has my kids as a pillar of light and I should go be my own pillar of light. And I'm sitting here going like, oh, I don't think I fully integrated that experience into obviously like my consciousness. So
well, I'm glad that this podcast could could bring that back to the surface, maybe
Yeah.
you'll have some work to do for the rest of the day today to integrate
Right?
that.
Isn't that interesting? It's
Yeah.
funny. It's very interesting how these things all work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to, since we have about 20 minutes left, I kind of want to shift gears now and talk to you about probably the thing that interests me the most in the field of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And it's something that I think is unfortunately, like, it's super fascinating, but unfortunately, I think it's being held in the psychedelic space as a bit of a taboo topic to talk about. So to set the stage, most of what people are reading about psychedelic therapies these days have a lot to do with healing, right? Healing PTSD, healing depression, healing chronic pain, these types of things. And I think that's great. And I definitely think that that kind of stuff needs to be out there. People need relief from their pain, or at least means to explore it and heal themselves from it. However, my primary interest in psychedelics and non-ordinary states of consciousness is more in line with another, I totally forget his name, but he's famous for coining the phrase betterment of the well, and talking about, how can everyday ordinary people who might not be suffering with depression or chronic pain, how can they utilize psychedelics, not necessarily to heal things, but to improve or enhance their mental functioning, their brain functioning, their body functioning, maybe even evolve a little bit faster during this lifetime. And so we hear about these kind of things a little bit with like microdosing, improving creativity, and improving eye-hand coordination. We have stories of Native American and Viking warriors using psychedelics when they go out on hunts to improve their hunting and cardiovascular capacities, when they go into battle to reduce pain, things like this. And I'm really interested in how we can use psychedelics in a way to enhance things we're already doing well. Me personally, I have microdosed during jujitsu competitions, during practices, and I notice a drastic improvement in a lot of different areas from the influence of psychedelics. And again, maybe this is placebo, maybe not, but either way, it's working, And I think a while ago you had told me that you play piano. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I want to bring this into the fold a little bit and talk about, flow states that you achieve while playing the piano or while doing your work or anything else, and how you think psychedelics may fit into the future of human evolution, of human performance, things like that. I'm in the fight game. I'm a combat athlete, and I know that within my networks, within the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC, all these fight sports, there are so many fighters now exploring microdosing of both LSD and psilocybin for sport performance. Not sure if it's made it into the Olympics yet, but I would not be surprised if many of the Olympians were on some kind of microdose of some sort. I know that most professional snowboarders these days have reported being on microdoses for competitions, part of that culture. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there is definitely a role for using these substances in a much wider circle than just treating, resistant depression and anxiety. And furthermore, we actually would really like to be treating patients with these substances who have diagnosable mental illness before they become treatment resistant. We'd kind of like this to be, those of us who are especially using them on a regular basis would like this to become the standard treatment. Oh, you're depressed? Go do some preparation, do some mushrooms, do integration, and hit your therapy. And a year later, your trajectory is way different than like, well, here's your Prozac. Oh, that didn't work. Here's your Paxil. That didn't work, whatever. So, even when it comes to mental illness, we want to see these medications used sooner and more ubiquitously, because it does kind of feel like we're reconnecting to a lot of our humanity that we've lost over the years, right? Knowledge, right, that we used to have, indigenous wisdom, that has, again, long been lost to the masses, that needs to kind of come back, connection to the planet. So I'm all for psychospiritual growth type purposes. That's what I would consider myself in that category, as like not really having diagnosable illness, but knowing that I could be better, wanted to be better, that there was a way to be better, but then kind of not understanding how to get there, and using these medicines to show the way. I think microdosing and macrodosing are like two superbly different conversations, right? The intention around them is really, really quite different. Whereas the macrodoses is trying to show you big picture things and big blocks and big openings, whereas microdosing is, like you said, kind of closer to just improving your ability to access flow states, have more cognitive flexibility, improves performance, maybe slightly shutting up that inner critic that's like keeping you down 10%, just like, not to bastardize it, but it's like one beer. I always bowl way better after one beer because I'm not like constantly beating myself up, and like microdosing can do something similar. LSD for sure has vascular effects. So, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense to me. I think that, I think it'll be very useful, and I really hope that it does become like widespread. I worry a little bit about, like accessibility when we start talking about that. If we, all of a sudden just like make it for the masses, and then the only people that can afford it are, and it's this way even with medical at this point, are like more wealthy people. We're just going to continue to create a divide if it's like the more we use it. And so I'm just cognizant of it. I certainly don't have an answer. It's accessibility is something that my clinic is working really hard on, like improving and trying to make things more fair, for lack of a better word.
Ketamine treatments are not cheap.
Hmm?
Ketamine treatments are not cheap.
No, they're not. Well, it's a lot. It's a very intensive. It's very labor intensive. It's not the medication. Everybody's always like, oh, ketamine is cheap. Yeah, absolutely is cheap. It's not the medication. It's how much time we spend talking with you. It's how much education we do. It's how much time you're in the clinic. It's the, all these, it's so time intensive, and all psychedelic treatment is time intensive, right? You're going to do psilocybin, you're going to do MDMA, you're going to be there for 8 hours. And like, you have to pay for that, and the only reason why it's not cheap too, when I look at other procedures, like, do you have any idea what a colonoscopy costs, which is like 10 minutes, 15 minutes if the GI doctor is good? No, because your insurance pays for that. So, but no one is paying for ketamine treatment. So it looks really expensive, but in the grand scheme of medical treatments, my treatment is actually way cheaper. It's way cheaper than Spravato. It's way cheaper than most procedures. It just looks expensive because insurance is not covering it and buffering what right? Like when I had a C-section and that bill was like $50,000, right? So, and then like IV ketamine compared, well, I could go on about the insurance thing all day, but like, a series of IV ketamine treatments for someone's acute suicidality is way less expensive than getting hospitalized. But what does insurance pay for? Throw you in the hospital for 5 days and, just traumatize you there instead. So there's a lot, once we get into accessibility and cost and whatever, there's a lot that has to be sorted out, but they're definitely, in general, unfortunately, once it's like good for every access of every aspect of your health, it'll only be available for those who can afford it. And we'll just continue that divide. That's my kind of like my biggest.
Yeah, I would think that that the accessibility issue is still present, but maybe less of an issue when it comes to microdosing, only because the amount used is so little, and most people microdose on their own, not in a clinic. People can grow their own mushrooms, and one tub of mushrooms will last a long time with microdosing. One little tab of LSD, you could cut it into 10 and it would last you a lot longer than just one. So I think the accessibility is a little bit, I think microdosing is a little more accessible, or will be in the future, hopefully, to people who cannot afford the more expensive macro treatments that require many, many hours. So back to the use of the widespread use of microdosing, and what we're kind of picturing for the future. If Well, that'd be cool, I guess. If everybody was microdosing one day, I wonder what the world would be like. Um, but just it's your opinion, if you found out that you needed that C-section surgery, but you also found out that your surgeon was microdosing while he's doing the procedure, would you or would you not be okay with that?
I think as long as we're like, as long as we're sticking to the true definition of microdosing, which is
Mhm.
like subperceptual,
Mhm.
subperceptual doses, then I'm totally fine with it. I laugh when I say that because, and I think there's an education piece that I'm holding in my head, because where do you get educated on how to microdose and who's guiding you,
Mhm.
right? We talk with patients a lot about that, but most physicians aren't, most physicians don't. And some patients need that physician, discussion or education or permission or whatever. And some patients are on medications that are going to get in the way. And so there's a whole nother piece of like both the medical system getting educated and then like getting people educated who could benefit from it.
Mhm.
There are lots of like online great programs that I think help people come to microdosing, like microdosing regimens, like with intention.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
anyway,
I coach a lot of people on their dosage and their regimen and still set and setting and how to take most advantage of their microdosing if they're already doing it. And I think that is still very valuable education that we as practitioners can provide for our clients rather than
yeah,
just, yeah.
yeah. So I think that yeah, I think ultimately, I think it would be fine as long as it was like truly microdosing, because
Mhm.
that's what it's supposed to be. It's subperceptual, and it really, in a way, I relate it to serotonergic agents, right? So like psilocybin is serotonergic, LSD is serotonergic, and all of the SSRIs are doing something very similar to microdosing. You're
Mhm.
inducing a little bit of cognitive flexibility in the brain and the default mode network via increased serotonin.
Mhm.
That's my own kind of opinion. And so I think that actually microdosing is a better stand-in for serotonergic agents, because humans are not machines. You can't just like put a drop of oil in every day and we're going to respond the same. Our bodies adapt, right? And so I think the biggest problem with psychiatric medications is that our brains are becoming constantly tolerant,
Mhm.
because it's adapting. It knows that you're going to put that in there, and so then ultimately over time it behaves differently, which is why the medications, one of the reasons why I think the medications tend to peter out over a year or two. And microdosing regimens typically are one, every 3 or 4 days, a small dose every 3 or 4 days. And so the brain doesn't really like habituate or accommodate to that, because it's not something you're doing every day.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm wondering, and that's one of, I think I'm aware of 4 microdosing protocols that have been spoken about quite extensively, although I have clients coming to me all the time with brand new protocols that I've never seen before that they're doing. I'm like, if that's working for you, fine. Um,
Right.
yeah. As far as like comparing SSRIs or any psychiatric medication and a microdose, and again, I'm not an expert on psychiatric medication. I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a psychiatrist. But what I notice in my clients is that those who microdose as opposed to those who remain on like antidepressants have far fewer negative side effects long term, whether it be sexual dysfunction or lethargy or anhedonia or whatever are the side effects of these medications. Yeah, you may get the relief, but if you instead take a microdose, which is probably cheaper and has almost none of those negative side effects, I think that's a huge thing that Western medicine does not want to address necessarily publicly. They want to keep the money rolling.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I hope I hope I was understood. I'm not in any way pro the
Sure.
serotonergics. I don't want people to be taking even 10 milligrams or 5 milligrams of Paxil or Prozac, but I'm just thinking, I have just been wondering, I'll talk to a psychiatrist and they'll tell me, well, there's a certain amount of people who get better on serotonergic agents. And so what is it that is making those people better? I am always asking them of my ketamine patients, what is it that's made you better in this situation, so that we can continue to harness that benefit. And so I have been feeling like the boost in serotonin, that small boost in serotonin, is what gives what I call cognitive flexibility. And so you're not like really rigid in the way that you're thinking about things. You have the option to look at things just a little bit differently or notice things that weren't quite there, right? And that's like when you're hunting, like, because you're just a little more open, you might hear something snap that you wouldn't have because you were too narrow focused.
Mhm.
That's how my brain kind of like, conceptualizes it. But I do think that I think that traditional psychiatric medications would be better off if they actually use them only intermittently.
Mhm.
And then I don't think you would get that like really blunting attenuation of the serotonin system that ultimately leads to feeling like a zombie, sexual side
Mhm.
effects, all that kind of stuff.
So it's more about the
That,
chronic use as opposed to the medication itself. It's the chronic use of the medication.
right. It's like if you constantly are, it's almost like the amygdala again. It's, you don't have that ability to differentiate, right? When you're just constantly hitting it like this, you don't see the difference, and you have to kind of do the ups and the downs. So yeah, I think you could use them intermittently, but I would also rather people microdose, and certainly there aren't any major pharmaceutical companies that are pushing that. And, it's going to take decades to really get psychiatry in alignment with that. Unfortunately, it's really, a time and time again, I hear like, I'm sitting in the doctor's office and there's a poster for Trintellix and they're like, well, why don't you try Trintellix? And it's like really hard to trust your physician is doing the right thing for you when there's a giant ad sitting next to your head for the drug they recommended for you, like.
Yeah, and a brand new Porsche outside that the drug company bought them.
Right. And we actually recommend a lot of supplements in my office, but it's for that reason that I don't carry them in the office.
Mhm.
Like, I want you to go buy it from Amazon so you know that I have absolutely no financial benefit of you taking whatever supplement I'm telling you to bake, not like loading your arm up with stuff on your way out the door and conveniently making more money off of that.
Well, we certainly need more practitioners like you out there. And I want to be respectful of your time. In the last minute or so, I was wondering if you want to share with the audience any sort of upcoming events. I know that we've already passed the conference that you headed up last November. So are there any upcoming events, any sort of organizations that people should check out, websites? How might they reach out to you as well if they have additional questions?
Yeah, upcoming events. I stepped away from the American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners. It's a great organization that's really trying to help work on the issues of accessibility, standardization. There are lots of things in this realm that we didn't touch on today, but they're a great advocate, and they have an amazing patient portal. So they have a lot of resources to help patients either find practitioners or know when to pick the right one and what kind of questions to ask and that kind of stuff. So that's at askp.org. I did step down from them to, spend more time with my family and be more present and really do all those things that we talked about earlier, which was, another result of doing, having these experiences that are kind of like, well, you need to be spending your time at home, not all these organizations. The Psychedelic Medicine Association is working really hard to educate practitioners and patients in the field as the science comes out, so that and encourage practitioners and patients to be having those conversations together so they can be doing things like microdosing and macrodosing, in an informed way. Right. I have patients who are like, oh, I'm going to go do MDMA with so-and-so practitioner, but they're on medications that are going to get in the way, so we need to be able to have those conversations, those open, honest conversations. So they're another organization that I'm following that I think would be good. And I can always be reached at Dr. Oxley, DROXLEY at MichiganProgressiveHealth.com or through the website, MichiganProgressiveHealth.com. Yeah, but otherwise, no other upcoming events. I'm trying to be at home a little bit more with my family. My daughter's got dance competition coming up, and there's a lot going on at home.
Well, I hope that in the future, you and I get to meet in person, maybe at the 2023 MAPS conference if you're planning on going there. It's going to be here in Colorado. So I hope that I get to one day meet you and shake your hand, and
Yeah.
that'd be cool. Well, thank you again. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, is it the MAPS conference, or it's psychedelic science is in Denver in 2023? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yep.
I am planning on going, so
Good.
let's schedule a dinner.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, those are the last one I went to in Oakland was huge. It was awesome. So I'm really looking forward to being on my home turf. I don't have to travel as far. Well, thank you again for joining us today on the podcast. It's been super informative and very educational, and meeting those educator goals of yours. So it's awesome. Thank you again for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.